I'm going. We need to close that door.
Behind you, though.
Welcome, everyone. Just give us a couple minutes to get started. We're working through some of those technical issues to get Chris some better sound going. So hang in there. Wasn't that session amazing? I hope everyone was able to attend. If not, there will be a recording as well that you can view later. So make sure to tell everyone who was not at that session to go check it out, because that was pretty amazing. Hey, Chris. You want to say something to see if it works? One more time.
Can you hear me okay? Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds better. At least we can definitely hear you. Sounds better than last time. So great. I'm glad it's working. All right. Welcome to the Using Data to Create More Equitable Infrastructure conversation. Our speaker today is Chris Wiltsey, the 1,000 Miles Program Director of Bike Utah. We are grateful for his time today. And the last 10 minutes of this session is reserved for questions. So feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll get them to Chris once he's finished presenting. Chris, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about earlier. I guess something was wrong with my computer, so I just changed computers and it seems to be working now. Let me get my presentation going. Okay, great. So my presentation is about how we've been using data to create more equitable infrastructure. So early last year, we actually received a grant from Spin Scooters. It was called the Mobility Data for Safer Streets and grant. And what that grant included were a bunch of data platforms that allowed us to look at transportation in ways that we previously hadn't. So one of the main data platforms we used was called StreetLight data. And so what StreetLight does is it uses cell phone data to determine what kind of travel somebody is, what mode of travel. So are they riding a bike? Are they walking? Are they driving a car? And so we were able to kind of get a better and clearer picture of what people were doing. But if we're talking about equity, it starts getting kind of sticky because, and pretty tragic actually, when we start looking at things like fatality rates, it's 23% higher for Latin bicyclists than white bicyclists, 30% higher for Black bicyclists than white bicyclists. And we sort of ask ourselves, why is this the case? Is it just, this is just how things are? But if you actually start looking into the data, there's some pretty clear reasons why this is happening. If you're looking at income, 30% of annual income is spent by poorest families on transportation. And this can be a limiting factor in people actually being able to own a car. A car can cost as much as $8,000 a year. A bike maybe costs you a couple $100, maybe nothing potentially, right? Because it's just you powering it. So that's why oftentimes we see lower income folks riding their bikes, and this actually plays out in the data. So this was kind of something interesting. For our MDSS grant, we had access to data for Orem, Provo, Springville, and part of Vineyard. And what we found was that in Provo, specifically, there was a clear correlation between people riding their bikes relative to their income. So the lower somebody's income was, the more likely they are to ride their bikes in Provo. And that was the same case for Springville and Orem. And that's interesting because these three communities represent the different types of communities that exist in Utah. So Orem is sort of your generic suburban community. Provo has more of an urban feel to it, but it also has a suburban flavor as well. And Springville is a mixture of suburban and rural. So you get kind of a clear overview of how people are using transportation in these different communities. So traditionally, what we've used is Strava data. And what Strava data is people turn on this app on their cell phones, and they usually use it while they're riding their bikes recreationally. So if you look at the data here, what you see is a lot of people riding long distances and riding very quickly and riding on main streets. So we're talking about arterials and corridors. You see a lot of that, or these pathways heading up canyons. But that's not telling a clear picture of how people are actually riding bikes. That's telling a very small piece of that whole puzzle. What we actually find in the data is that bicycle riding and driving in automobiles actually looks very similar. What we find is that people are riding their bikes in their downtown areas. This is an example from Provo, and these are called origin and destination maps. And so it's just showing where people are coming from and where they're going to. And we see this repeatedly, that people on bikes and people in cars are traveling much the same way as one another. And we're also seeing that bicyclists are actually predominantly riding very short distances, and they're riding fairly slowly. But if you looked at Strava data, you would think that cyclists are generally riding in the completely opposite way. And this will be significant as we look at some of the other data and how that feeds into planning. This is an alluvial diagram, so this shows that different times of day and where they are riding from and where they are going. And this looks very similar to how people are driving their cars. BYU, or Brigham Young University, is the #1 destination for people who are traveling throughout the city for work. And so this is bicycle data right here, and people are doing the same exact thing. They're coming from the university, they're going to the university. And then if you start looking at like a heat map of Provo, if you just sort of take everything and you look at Provo, where people are riding all year long, every single day of the year, all times of day, this is what it looks like. It's all concentrated around their urban core, which, thinking back to that Strava data, you would think that they'd be not riding in the urban core, they'd be riding on those pathways. And so if we're thinking about people who are lower income or riding because they have to, this makes a lot of sense, because they're riding for utility or practical purposes. They're riding to go to work, they're riding to go to eat food. And this starts to have implications in these assumptions that we make about how people ride their bikes, and how they're getting around actually plays into how we start to plan for these facilities. So this is from Provo's transportation master plan. And if you look at the dotted areas, that's where they plan to put in new facilities. And the pink hexagons, those are where people are riding. So that's that heat map that I just showed you. And so you can kind of see that where they're planning to put in facilities are sort of a box around this area where people are actually riding. So it brings into these questions, it brings up questions of where are we investing our money? In this case, it looks like there's an investment in some suburban areas where people aren't necessarily riding. And there could be a case to be made there that you could induce demand for people to ride bikes by building facilities where they don't exist currently. But if we think back to the statistics earlier about the rate at which people are dying on bicycles according to their race, even their income, then there's definitely an argument for building infrastructure in the places where people are actually riding and in the way that they're actually riding. So this is Springville. Going back to that point I was making, these are communities that show sort of the range of possible communities throughout Utah. You see sort of the same thing where you're seeing a lot of riding in the urban core. If you actually look at race data, it actually matches up pretty perfectly with where especially the Latin community exists in Springville and in other communities. You do see sort of this correlation between facilities. You can see that's Hobble Creek Canyon going up the right side of the image, but predominantly you're seeing that riding going on in the urban core. And you see the same thing in Orem, this very sort of car-centric city you're seeing in this urban area. If there is such a thing in Orem, that's where it's happening. And you pay close attention to that very tall geometry because I'm going to show you what that actually looks like on the ground. This is the #1 intersection where people are riding in Orem. So keep in mind that Orem also has the Murdoch Canal, which is a very popular recreational facility. But if you consider this area and you think about it from the perspective of people who have to ride their bikes and they're riding it just like somebody would drive a car, this place makes a lot of sense. On the backside, there's housing, there's a mall, there's all these places to eat, there's different places to work, there's a university down the road. So basically, in terms of planning and planning theory, we often talk about creating a diversity of destinations. We have these mixed use developments that we're trying to create. So this represents that in a lot of ways. So a lot of people are going to be riding their bikes here. But if you think about it from a comfort and safety level, this is pretty scary, I would say. And I've actually wrote on this a lot, and it can be terrifying and very uncomfortable. And if we're talking about some of these ideas of like, how are we planning our facilities? Where are we putting them? How do we plan equity into this? We actually see that there's this correlation between traffic and these different minority groups. So we're actually building facilities around where these folks live, which makes it less safe for them. If we're talking about them riding short distances, then the streets around where they live are very dangerous as well. And on the flip side of that, you look at this correlation between white folks living in these communities and where traffic exists, or your average daily traffic, it actually goes down. So the more white a community is, or the more white a neighborhood is, the less likely they are to have these large facilities with a lot of traffic. And if we look at Provo, you can kind of see that segregation that we're talking about. And you can see, like on the west side or the right side of this map, there's a lot more blue dots, which are white folks, and the yellow and orange dots, or orangish dots, are Latin folks. And so you can see they're closer to the freeways, they're closer to where a lot of these arterials or very large roads are. And then you can look on the right side where it's just like a blanket of blue, and there's really no big facilities in some of these neighborhoods. And you see the same thing in Salt Lake City. It's more, that difference is very clear, where you can kind of see on the right side, there's this huge chunk where you see no major roadways. It's just all neighborhood streets. But then you look on the west side and next to the freeway and where all these large roads are, same thing going on. And Provo, as a case study in what we're talking about, we actually split up. We created this framework for looking at transportation from automobile transportation from coming from outside and leaving Provo to other communities versus just travel within the community. And so all of this on the left side is that outside travel, and all of those people are getting funneled onto these main roadways that are cutting through these Latin communities in Utah and making it unsafe for them to ride bikes, which they ride bikes at higher levels. And you can see this same trend with other racial groups. And if you're talking about within our communities, you have that about 36% of people in Provo are just taking these short trips within the city boundaries, and you can actually break that down, and you see that most of these trips are actually happening under 3 miles, which that's like the sweet spot. We call that like the bike shed of what is possible for people to comfortably ride their bikes. And so these are also all of these trips that are getting funneled onto certain roadways that are cutting through these communities and these neighborhoods of these people of color and low-income folks. And if we could ride our bikes, how much safer does that make for those communities? And also investing in those communities, and not always investing in cars, but investing in bicycles. So the 1,000 Miles program has a framework for understanding these things. This is sort of a broad brush, kind of basic perspective, but the basic idea is that as the number of cars and speeds increases, so should the intensity of infrastructure increase. So on neighborhood streets with not a lot of cars and not very high speeds, all you really need are some traffic calming elements that would enforce those speeds and just kind of make it safer for everybody. And then as speeds increase and vehicles increase, so we're talking maybe in like a downtown area, people aren't going super fast, but they're going faster. You could put in a cycle track, and there's different ways that you could put these in. You could use bollards, that's relatively cheap. You could even use cars, that's very cheap. All that takes is paint, theoretically. And then as we're getting very fast, so now we're talking about highways or very large arterials, you can actually put in these separated pathways. But one thing I've seen as I've tracked these facilities throughout Utah is basically all we have in Utah, with a few exceptions, are these kind of facilities, the multi-use trails, and then painted bike lanes. There's no sort of middle ground. So if we're thinking about these types of places where people are driving, they look like this, or these neighborhood streets, they're not always very safe, especially for people who are forced to or don't have a choice to, as to whether they ride their bikes or drive. And lastly, I just wanted to show this picture, because this is from Copenhagen. I think this is a great image because it shows, if you kind of look at it, they've split their roadway between bikes and people and walking and cars. And the mode split in Copenhagen is about 40% to 50% biking and 50% or 40% cars, which to me, this tells an important fact that what we invest in is what people will do. So if we invest in bicycle infrastructure, and that's what we want people to do, and we do this in meaningful ways, then that's what we'll get. But if we invest in cars and we invest in bicycle infrastructure, we make it unsafe for so many different communities, and that's what we're going to get as we invest in that. Questions?
Great. Thank you, Chris, for all that. We have a lot of questions in the chat. Let's start with a really quick one. Are you using Blinksy data? And is anyone else here? You can answer Helen Peters' chat in the comment, but Chris, did you use that data?
Am I using what kind of data?
Yeah, you can answer that, but also are you using specifically Blinksy data? Chris is pulling something up.
Okay, sorry. Can you say that one more time? It was muted.
Oh, Blinksy data.
I don't Blinksy data? Blinksy.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know what that is. I haven't used it.
So not everyone has access to StreetLight data. So how can people take what we've learned today and utilize it in their own communities?
I guess in some ways you can take my word for it. But what I think the big takeaway from this is, okay, we have all this planning theory that says if you build this type of infrastructure, this is the kind of transportation people are going to use. And we're actually seeing that play out in the data. So we have some proof now that that's actually, that planning theory actually works and that it actually is true. And also, there's a lot of national data. And I think for a lot of people, maybe in the back of their mind, at least in the back of my mind, I think, is this national data, is this stuff they're finding in Portland or New York applicable in Utah? And what we're finding in the data is that, yes, it is actually applicable. And so if we're talking about like race and how people are riding, we're finding the same thing here in Utah. If you're talking about income, there's this clear correlation between income and bicycle ridership. And so understanding that, and I think the other big thing is being more purposeful in how we plan and the type of facilities we put out, and not framing recreational facilities as utility facilities, because a lot of times they don't function that way. And we need to be very careful about what we're building and how we're spending our money.
There have actually been quite a few questions about Strava data in the chat. What would you, I mean, you mentioned this before, but like, is there a way to utilize Strava data that does make it functional for everyone?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at building recreational facilities or making them safer for people who are riding recreationally, which those can be people of all races, of all incomes, Strava makes a lot of sense, but I think we need to be using the right tools for the right job. And so we shouldn't be using Strava data when we're trying to get a clear picture of the totality or how everybody is riding their bikes.
Thank you. Hold on. Thank you again for everyone and all the engagement that we've seen today. I think we have time for one more question. Waiting for that to come in. So are university students contributing mostly to the bicycling data disproportionately?
Yeah, but they're still low income, right? And so you're going to be, but that's why I showed Orem and Springville, because a lot of that ridership doesn't actually represent student ridership. Because if you look at Orem, if it was students, you would see a lot of riding to UVU. But what you're actually seeing is a lot of people riding to go to work and do things like that and go shopping in Orem. But definitely in Provo, that's why you saw that huge correlation in Provo, was because of students, because they're riding to BYU. and to other places to work and do things that other people would use their cars for.
Awesome. Next question, how do you think these findings could apply to other communities? Is there a way that we could do a study on where to put facilities based on riding frequency for UDOT Region 2 or maybe just the Salt Lake Valley?
Yeah, I think as a framework that has become very clear to me recently, especially through looking at this data, is this idea of good planning, at least if we're talking about planning from a pro-bicycle perspective, is all about decreasing the distance between origin and destination. And if we know there are dense areas, so for example, a lot of people are living where there are a lot of places to eat and work and play, then those are the places we should be putting in bike facilities, because we know, at least from these case studies, that that is where people are riding their bikes. So if you have a downtown in your community, then it's reasonable for you to assume that's where you should be investing your bicycle facilities in urban environments. If that is your goal, and this goes back to that question about Strava, right? Like if your goal is to create recreation facilities, and every community needs to be asking themselves this, is like, what do we want as a community? But it kind of seems in my experience that we have sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to how we build facilities. And I think we need to be like very purposeful in what is our vision for our communities. But if your goal is to make it safe for low-income folks and people who don't have a choice to ride, but also making it feasible for people who want to begin to ride as a choice, then yeah, put your facilities in your more dense urban areas.
Thank you. Sorry, I was off on the time. We still have plenty of time, so keep those questions coming into the chat, everyone. This is a great conversation and discussion, especially as we all like try to move forward and be better and more intentional in our designs and more inclusive in our designs for everything, but specifically cycling.
I think I'd like to answer Greg's question. Greg Sanchez, I see it down there in the chat.
Go for it.
I think that's I completely agree with you, Greg. I think that's the problem, right? Is if we use Strava data, it represents more wealthy and more white cyclists. And so we can't be using Strava data if those are the questions we're talking about. At least we can't use it in its current form. I know Stephanie Tomlin is working on some efforts at UDOT to find a way to use Strava data in a more representative way. And I think that could be really powerful if we could use that in that way. But as far as data sets, I guess there's like a couple options. We got to put out a bunch of counters. Like if we want actual data that is completely representative and doesn't have like any sausage making in the back end, then it's got to be a bunch of counters, and we have to invest there. The other option is we invest in StreetLight data, but it's very expensive. For this this grant that we received, if I had paid for it, it would probably cost anywhere from like $150,000 to $200,000. And Tyler asks, how's StreetLight data gathered? It's kind of Big Brother, right? Like all of your cell phones, all of our cell phones are just sending out this tracking data, and it's collecting a sample of all that data. And then according to how fast you're moving and how far you're going and all of these different variables, it determines what mode of transportation you're using. Yeah, and Stephanie, just to echo what she's saying, yeah, we need more counters ASAP, because, right, StreetLight isn't going to be perfect either, because it's making certain assumptions, but I think the fact that it makes sense, like in my gut, I trust it. as much as I trust Strava, but Strava is telling a different story and it's representing different kinds of people, right?
Great. This is such a great conversation. Keep those comments coming in. We have about 5 minutes left, so feel free to ask any questions. The next question is, where do you expect this project to go in the future within Bike Utah and the 1,000 Miles program?
So it actually ends in like a day. So we'll lose access, but we're like trying to crank out a bunch of data so we can like keep analyzing it over the next little while. I've been talking with some folks at the Salt Lake Tribune about maybe applying for the grant again this year. I don't know if it's going to happen, just because maybe they're tired of me, but at Spin. But the idea would be to maybe look at Salt Lake County or Salt Lake City and start crafting a bunch of stories around this data and just like churning out a bunch of data like we've been doing in Utah County and telling that story, some of these stories that we've kind of been touching on about equity and what that looks like for bicycling and other modes of transportation.
Thanks. There's another question in the chat that asks, does it take into consideration kids without phones and how they commute to school?
No, yeah, so that's a great question. That goes back to that point I was making about StreetLight having its limitations and making certain assumptions. Because StreetLight isn't using like absolutely every single person that is riding their bike. It's using a sample of the population. So for Provo, it was 5,000 people. So theoretically, that could be the whole bicycling population because what's Provo's population? Maybe 150,000. But yeah, it's definitely going to be making certain assumptions, but it's going to be you'd assume statistically representative. I would say it's probably more representative than a lot of like surveys that we do, right? Where it's very self-selected, whereas this is a bit different.
From another commenter, another issue is that cyclists often use routes that are mostly bike compatible, but have some critical links that are unfriendly to cyclists and pedestrians, especially in commercial or urban areas. There needs to be a focus on removing bottlenecks to increase accessibility and safety. Is there a way for the StreetLight data to identify and address these?
Yeah, I didn't show an image of this, but one thing we did was we tracked, it's hard to describe, but basically we tracked all the cycling in certain neighborhoods or in urban areas, and then we used an algorithm to determine what the best route would be, like what's the quickest route that could get somebody to their destination from their origin. And that could be like an interesting way of determining what are the most important routes for the greatest number of people and investing in those places. And I think that's one of the big obstacles we have right now, is that we need to be spending our money and investing it in these little issues like what you're describing, where we have these bottlenecks, instead of like just trying to always just get a new facility out. Sometimes it's just we need to actually be improving the quality of the existing infrastructure. I'm going to put my email in the chat, so folks like Grant, Alan, if you want to reach out to me, we can chat.
Yeah, and if anyone has one last question, you can squeeze it in. Otherwise, thank you again for participating in our session today. We're going to have a little break, but we're going to come back again with our mountain biking conversation. So we're really excited to have everyone on board, and thank you. We'll see you in a bit.